Welcome everybody to Highside, Lowside. I am Zach. That is Spurge. This is season 9, episode 5. Coming up on the pod today, we have MotoGP journalist Mat Oxley, who's going to talk us through some of the history of motorcycle world championship racing. I am very excited, as you can imagine. Also, moto superstitions. And do motorcycles feel different in North America or Europe or India or Africa? All that and more coming up, everybody.
Here at Highside and Lowside, we love all forms of two-wheeled transportation, and that includes you, scooter riders. So whether you are just riding around town, or maybe you've checked out that episode of CTXP where Ari and Zach are ripping around a racetrack on a super scooter that they built, and you've got aspirations to do the same thing, we have got you covered because Motul has a full line of scooter lubricants. That's right. Whether you're rocking a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke, you can change your scooter's oil using a quality Motul product. You learn more about all of the scooter oil over on RevZilla.com/Motul. That's RevZilla.com/MOTUL. And when you're over there on RevZilla.com, just keep in mind that every time you make a purchase with RevZilla, a little bit of that money goes back into funding the programs that you enjoy. Whether it's Zach and I sitting here talking with you on Highside, Lowside, or the shenanigans that people get into when you're out riding for a CTXP episode, or maybe you just appreciate the gear reviews and the product information. RevZilla gives back to riders because that's who we all are. Riders. So keep that in mind next time you need to make a purchase for your motorcycle. From cruisers to sport bikes to adventure bikes and everything in between, we've got you covered at RevZilla.com.
Alrighty, everybody. As I said, I am very excited because we get to talk about motorcycle racing today. But just so you know, the idea here is for it to be everyone's discussion about motorcycle racing. We're going to talk about history, personalities. It's not going to be super granular and talking about aerodynamics and stuff like that. We're going to reach back into motorcycling history and hopefully have it be a broad discussion with interesting facts and figures and that kind of thing.
And that's what I'm here for. I'm here to play devil's advocate to make sure that Matt and Zach don't get too stuck in the weeds because, it's funny because I have a lot of friends that listen to the podcast. And they'll be like, oh, well, you don't like MotoGP. I like MotoGP. I just don't follow it as closely as you do, Zach. And I don't know all the little nitty gritty details. So I think what we're going to try and do today is give a fun historical overview over the last 100 or so years of motorcycle racing to maybe spark an interest in people, that don't know where to start and aren't really sure some of where the foundation started from. And for those of you that don't know, Matt is an author, a journalist, a podcaster, and he's just a tremendous wealth of knowledge when it comes to motorcycle racing. And we're going to get into all of that in just a moment, but we are going to hit not the news first.
Yes, sir.
When you're listening to this, if you are listening to it as it comes out, it is almost
Hallows Eve.
And if you are a motorcyclist, there might be some spooky superstitions that you believe in. So Zach and I thought it would be fun to start the timer. And this was actually an email that came in from a Highside Lowside listener that wanted us to kind of hit on some of these spooky superstitions. And you can shoot us an email and let us know if you believe in any of this or if it's just a bunch of hoopla. So,
okay. So let's start the timer and start listing the most common superstitions that we Googled.
Ride with your rear passenger pegs up, because if you ride with your rear passenger pegs down, you are inviting otherworldly spirits to ride with you, and they might cause accidents.
I wasn't expecting you to be so into this Halloween thing. I actually don't really know. I'd never heard that superstition, I don't think. But I do. This is funny because a colleague of ours here in California started dating a gal last year sometime. And the way we found out was that Ari noticed that the pegs were down on his bike. He showed up to the office and the rear pegs were down. And we were like, what we got going on there? And he was like, oh, nothing. I don't know. So that was more fun than the superstition in my mind.
But let me ask you a question. Like, I've ride with my rear pegs down because sometimes I stretch out and I put my feet on the rear pegs. Does that mean that
a ghost is going to ride along with you? Yes, it does, Spurgeon.
Oh,
fact.
no. Oh.
Okay. Next one we found was dropping a new bike or a helmet is bad luck because that means is that right? It's bad luck because it means that you're going to do it in real life, basically.
If you drop your helmet, it means that you're going to drop your head next. So if you drop your helmet, buying a new helmet is the only sensible thing to do. Where can you do that? RevZilla.com.
Okay, jokes aside.
I feel like this was like I feel like our CEO, Zach Parham, threw this one out into ether to get people to buy more helmets.
This is a good superstition to have if for no other reason than don't drop your helmet. Be careful because it is important and it has single-use foam inside that only compresses once. So please be careful. I will say in my racing career, I knew people who would scuff up new leathers on purpose. They would like drag them across the asphalt or they would rub them on the ground. So so they already have a scuff on them. So like they don't have to, when they go out on the track, it's not like, oh, new leathers, I got to be careful. You know what I mean?
This is like when people buy Levi's and they sandpaper holes in the knees so they look worn in. Is that right. What they're doing?
I suppose it's equivalent of that. What about Spurge? Don't ride a dead man's bike.
Don't ride a dead man's motorcycle. You have to make it sound spooky. It's Halloween.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Apparently, if you ride a dead man or woman, I'm presuming this one came before people were being politically correct.
Yes.
But yes, do not ride a dead man or woman's motorcycle because their ghost is out there looking for it. And when they find it, they might knock you off.
Okay. I think this one's malarkey. I don't like this one. I don't subscribe to it. I think that if someone has passed on to the next realm, their motorcycle wants nothing more than to be ridden and used and leave a rich froth of thunder in its wake. And to deprive the motorcycle of that is to deprive it of its reason for being. I don't like that.
Debunked. Oh, so we have time for just one more.
What else?
Let's do green bikes. Apparently green motorcycles have a history of having bad luck. And there are people that feel like if you have a green motorcycle, you are more likely to crash and potentially die.
I wonder if people with Kawasaki's know about this. Or like, is it, cause I mean, that's not fair to just condemn a whole, it's like being like red bikes are bad luck. And then everyone who owns a Honda and a Ducati is like, oh no, that doesn't seem right. Does it?
I think so. This one, I think, if our research tells us anything, came from, military bikes being painted green. And there was some superstition around the fact that because green bikes were often identified as being military, they were often singled out during wartime as, potential enemies' motorcycles, and you would want to go after them.
Gotcha.
So I think that's where that comes from.
I see. So if you were riding around on a black motorcycle or a blue motorcycle, some people are like, oh, that's his civilian. We don't need to worry about that. But you're riding around on a green bike, then all of a sudden. Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
You're Steve McQueen trying to jump a fence, trying to get out of jail,
trying to get away from the, anyway. All right. So pivoting to the main discussion, Spurjo, we will invite Mat Oxley in here in just a moment. We are under the impression that some people are not, as big, racing fan as myself, as Matt, you alluded to this earlier, Spurge. We just want to give you a few quick reasons why you should care about MotoGP and why you think, or why we think you should be, interested in this episode.
First, dazzle me, Zach. Let's pretend I'm the audience member that doesn't care. I'm sitting back here and I'm about to turn this episode off. I don't want to listen to you guys talk to Mat Oxley. Why should I continue to listen?
1, speed. These motorcycles race at racetracks all around the world at speeds upwards of 220 miles per hour maximum speed. These are gladiators doing battle at ultra high speed, and it's the cutting edge. Also,
I'm intrigued.
Okay,
tell me more.
Also,
I'm coming around.
Money. Money. There's money everywhere in MotoGP. Riders get paid tens of millions of dollars. There's huge contracts. There's massive sponsorships. There's massive TV deals. It's a global sport. It's a high impact media empire that is MotoGP, and being in touch with that will connect you further to other people in the world and the racing and motorcycling community.
So as someone like yourself that's really in touch with MotoGP, has this paid off for you in dividends? Are you more wealthy than the average American?
Let's say yes. Also, number 3, it's like I said, a world championship. The world champion is the world champion. These are the world's best riders. There's no better motorcycling, road racing athletes, arguably, than in MotoGP, and that's pretty special. Also, another reason to be interested in it, which I get a real kick out of, and I know Matt does also, is the technology aspect of it. Historically, a lot of motorcycling technology has come from racing, whether it's electronics or whatever, or fluid dynamics in the engine, that kind of thing. Traction control, there's lots of things that the motorcycling community and motorcycling as a whole learns from racing, from competition. And I think that's cool and important.
And if none of that piques your fancy, Mat Oxley is an amazing storyteller.
He is.
He's an avid historian with a mind for detail, and he has a lovable British accent.
That's right.
So
which makes him nice and easy to listen to.
It's just soothing on the old ear hole. Without any further ado, I think let's bring Matt onto the podcast and let's get this conversation started. So welcome to the program, motorcycle racer, author, journalist, podcast host, Mat Oxley. Matt, did I miss any titles for you?
You didn't say anything rude about me, so that's cool. Thanks, Spurge. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it. We've been talking for a number of weeks now about all the questions we want to ask you about the history of motorcycle racing, MotoGP specifically. So I hope you had a nice stimulating lunch today and your brain is ready to fire on all cylinders.
Yeah. Or basically my brain, about 99% of my brain power is spent on motorcycle racing. The rest
perfect.
From the moment I get up to the moment I go to sleep, it's tragic really, but there you go.
Right, and Matt, for our audience, just as kind of like we're going to do a quick lightning round for those of you listening to let everyone who might not be familiar with Matt get a little bit of insider baseball on who Matt is and why he's here with us, as well as maybe some of the background that you might not be familiar with, even if you are familiar with his writing. Matt, first and foremost, where are you joining us from today? So where do you reside?
Yeah, well, first of all, Spurge and Zach, thank you for inviting me on. Fun to have this chat. I'm in London, UK, where I've lived most of my life. So I'm in the big bad city of London town.
And for those of you listening, the sunshine is presumably hiding behind some gloomy clouds for you there today, as always?
We're in October, so we're heading into the deep, dark wastes of winter. I kind of, don't talk to me in January or February. I won't want to talk to either anyone. That's just seasonal depression big time here.
Right on. Yeah. Well, we caught you at the end of the MotoGP season, at the end of the summer and into fall. So hopefully, your mood's bred enough. More to the two-wheeled point here, so that people can get to know you. Give us a quick rundown. What was your first motorcycle and how did you get into riding bikes?
My first motorcycle was a Honda CB125S, right? I was 17. This is in 1976, which was the best summer ever in British history. It was amazing. My brother had got a bike a couple of years before and he fell under the spell and I was like, come on. I had to wait till I was 17 and got a bike myself. And I'm still here. 48 years later, is it? Yeah, it's 48 years later. It's a lifelong love affair, basically. And it's just never gone away. It's the one constant throughout my whole life, really, my whole adult life. Yeah.
Right. And so for the audience listening, 1970, was it a 76 CB175?
I think it was 74. I had a little drum brake, single cylinder, 4-stroke, air cooled, just like a normal little motorcycle, tiny little front drum brake, like 5 inches across or 6 inches across. Did about 60, 70 miles an hour. But I got that in 76, started racing, not on that, but on another bike in 79. Got my first job as a journalist in 81 and started race until 1990, became a MotoGP journalist in 1988. So I'm on my 37th season of MotoGP now, covering it as a journalist. Which is why you're here with us today.
Yeah, exactly.
We couldn't think of anybody else that has your history in this sport.
Why would you want to do anything else, than write about motorbikes? I can't think of a better way to spend your life, to be honest.
So you've done your motorcycling, your racing career yourself. You did, if I understand correctly, quite a bit of endurance racing. You raced at Isle of Man. How do you how do you spend your majority of your time on bikes now? Do you race anymore or no?
Oh, no. I haven't raced I stopped in 1990 and I was fed up with getting hurt, and I have if you could say some magic, you can race without getting hurt, I might be up for it. But that's not going to happen. You get hurt when you race. That's as simple as that.
So no track days either? Like no on track, nothing, just.
No. The last time I rode around a track was I used to test all the Grand Prix bikes and everything, MotoGP bikes and stuff.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Which was awesome. But once you've got a long way from racing yourself, it ceases to be any point, because unless you can actually ride the things to some extent to what how they're supposed to be ridden, there's no point. And if I go on a track now, I haven't been on one for about 4 or 5 years, because when I go on now, I just depress myself with how slow I am, and it's just like, this is just horrible. I know I should be, way faster than this, but so I just don't bother. I love watching, and, I adore watching, and even more in my job, what I really enjoy is speaking to the riders and speaking to the engineers. That's what I love doing,
Right.
Do you have so, kind of shifting gears into some of your work side of things and not your riding side, do you have a favorite racer that you like, that you've enjoyed interviewing over the years, or somebody that really stands out as like, one of your better conversations?
So many. I mean, I'd put King Kenny Roberts, Valentino Rossi, Marc Marquez, Schwantz. The list goes on forever. Most of them, there are some racers that aren't very interesting, but I won't mention them. But, I've been so lucky to speak to all these guys. And I would say King Kenny Roberts is the most fun to interview, because he's pretty kind of, he takes it very seriously, but not at all seriously, which is a bit like how I take racing. I take it very seriously, but at the end of the day, the thing's just meant to be fun, right? Well, that is the basic idea.
Matt and I were talking a little bit before Zach got on, and I was telling Matt that Zach and I are coming off of a weekend down at Barber Motorsports Park in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were actually King Kenny Roberts was there because his whole collection is now getting donated to the museum.
Right.
And they had a host of you could get stuff signed, you could meet him, and he just seems like a genuinely kind and enthusiastic individual that just happens to be really, really good at motorcycle racing.
Yeah. He's I love the guy. I really do love him. He's just got everything going for him. He's funny. He's clever. He's fast. What he did fighting for riders' rights when he was racing, setting up his own team, building his own MotoGP bike from the ground up, a 2-stroke, and then building a 4-stroke from the ground up. Literally no one in the sport has done half that, So to me, without a doubt, he is the number one man. 100%, and I'm glad you had a nice time with him, because he's great fun. It's definitely it's exceptional fun to go out with in the evening. He can get a bit dangerous, but,
He is famously irreverent and loose, I suppose. In those situations. Well, to pivot to the topic of today's discussion, we were hoping to get some sort of broad perspective from you on the history of motorcycle racing, and sort of like why all of this stuff feels like it matters so much to so many people. I guess MotoGP celebrated its 75th anniversary this year, if that's correct. And so 1949, is that right, was the first season of what is now called MotoGP, but this sort of motorcycle racing world championship. And I guess I'm curious, as a sort of a kickoff, what do you know about the motorcycling landscape in the late 40s, and kind of like why did this coalesce and turn into a world championship? What was happening, as far as with the world of motorcycles, and sort of like why was that the year? And was it sort of like politically motivated, or was it prize money motivated, or I don't know. Is there anything in there?
I think we should probably go right back to the beginning, and because I've written lots of books about this, and I kind of write mostly about modern MotoGP, and then I wrote a book about the 60s and 70s, and I was like, oh, what happened in the 40s, 50s? So I love researching all that stuff. And eventually I wrote a book about the very beginning of how it all started, in the 1890s, you know. I mean, the first international motorcycle race was around a French street in 1904. The French, the Danish, the Germans, the British had national teams, and the French were caught cheating. They had a sidecar riding around in the opposite direction with all parts and everything for the French riders, but they were also throwing nails onto the track on one side of the track. So the French knew to ride on the other side, and the other guys all got punctures, so the French won. So that's a kind of great, you know.
That says something about the French.
Well, I mean, I think they had it in Austria the year after, and the Austrians cheated as well. You know, I mean, people cheat, right? That's what people do, you know. So it started there, and by the 20s, 30s, it was already an international sport, European sport. I mean, it was going on. You had, in the States, you had board track racing, which was basically around cyclodromes, but at like 60-degree angles. They were like thunder. They were like, if you've ever watched Rollerball, you know, they were racing around these things. I mean, crazy 1000cc, 4 strokes, twin cylinders with no brakes, no throttle. Basically, you just had an ignition button and the engine was either full on or off. And they raced around. I mean, just Google it. Find some movies on YouTube, board track racing. It's just mind boggling. You know, guys getting killed by crashing and getting sort of 2 feet splinters through them. And, you know, I mean, just mental. But why did it happen after the Second World War? Well, during the 20s and 30s, there was already a European championship that happened in countries around Europe. And basically, when it went to the World Championship, I think it'd been coming for a while. I mean, that's the obvious thing to do. If you've got a European Championship, well, why not make it a World Championship? You know, it's kind of obvious. And I guess that had been coming for a while. And I guess the war had finished, Second World War finished in 1945. So, you know, I think there was probably a huge push just to get back to normal life and let's do something great. And, you know, let's forget about all the horrible war. And so, yeah, they started it in 1949. It was for 500cc, 350cc, 250cc, I think, at that time. And then they added 125cc later. They added 50cc later. And then, you know, in all those classes kind of stayed similar until the turn of the century when they brought in 990cc 4 strokes to replace the 500cc 2 strokes. So it's just go on.
No, I'm sorry. I know. We Matt and Zach and I agreed to raise our hands because we're all very worried that we're going to start talking over each other. I'm going to try and represent the audience here, because I'm looking forward to this conversation, to learning from Matt more than I am being a contributor. So Matt, when we're talking about like they were putting these classes in, I understand it to be the FIM, and was the FIM, did the FIM, what is the FIM, and did they exist before 1949, or was the FIM created around this time to actually introduce international racing? Right.
The FIM still basically controls global motorcycle racing. Pretty much every motorcycle race that happens all around the world, not every, in some countries they run under different affiliations, runs under the affiliation of the FIM. The FIM stands for, I'm going to say this in English because it's a French, you know, Fédération Internationale Motocycliste, or motorcyclists. In French, it would be Fédération Internationale Motocycliste. So that was started in a restaurant in Paris in 1904. France was the start of the motor industry in cars and bikes for various reasons. They were way ahead. All the first races started in France, motorcycle races, car races. They used to do races from Paris to Marseille, Paris to Bordeaux, Paris to Madrid. Like the first, that's from the capital of France to the capital of Spain, about 400 or 500 miles. They had to stop it after 150 miles because there were already 15 people killed, right? They got to Bordeaux and they were like, whoa, you can't go any further. So there were already 15
there's nobody left to race.
No, there's already 15 people dead, and that includes spectators, because the roads there were people just getting run over by out of control racing cars and motorbikes. So it was pretty raw and pretty feral when it started. So the FIM was started in 1904 in a restaurant in Paris, and that's been in charge, if you like, to a greater or lesser extent of the sport ever since. Although, you know, MotoGP is run as a business by another company, but that they have to pay, MotoGP has to pay money to the FIM for the right to be able to run these races, you know, without getting too deep into the politics and business side of it, you know. So that's been a constant for the last 120 years, the FIM being in charge. And some people love the FIM, some people hate the FIM, you know, because there's lots of guys in nice suits, staying in nice hotels, eating nice lunches and dinners. I'll probably get into trouble for saying that, but there you go.
No, don't worry about it. No one listens to this podcast. A couple of things I wanted to bring up. One, we did talk about the support. Like you mentioned the 250cc bikes and 350cc bikes and 500cc bikes, and then eventually there were 125s and there were 80s and there were 50s and there were 750s, and it's been kind of all over the map with different engine configurations. I think for the sake of this conversation, we'll try to stick with like Premier class. History, just because the support classes really spin out. I did want to ask another question about the beginning, though. You mentioned that it was sort of a European championship in 1949. They created a world championship, but it was still only European, right? I mean, they didn't start doing races in South America or Asia or North America till quite a bit later. Is that right?
Yeah. The first out of Europe race was in Argentina in 1961, Argentine Grand Prix, and the Premier class there. I think there were 6 starters. No, maybe 9 starters and 3 finishers or 4 finishers or something. And like, you know, the first guy was 4 laps in front of the next guy, you know. So,
right.
And then I think the first US Grand Prix was at Daytona in 1964, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So, you know, and then gradually there was Japanese Grand Prix in the 80s, and then Malaysia came in the 90s, Australia came in the 80s, South Africa in the 1980s, Brazil in the 1980s. So it was just gradually expanding, and now we got like 20 rounds, and only half of them are in Europe. You know, the outer Europe rounds are USA, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, etc. Yeah.
So just kind of backing up for a second, because that's all great context. So I think it's important for our audience, especially our younger audience that might not be as familiar, you know, the landscape of Europe in 1949 is post World War II. A lot of European countries the cities were leveled, to kind of put it lightly, with coming out of, you know, World War II. So when motorcycle racing got started, what did the landscape look like? Like who was it that was bringing their motorcycles to race? What were the major brands of the time? And like realistically, like what did this race look like in the end of the 1940s into the 1950s?
Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed riders that were riding in that season, and they were, you know, driving around Europe in little old vans, you know, because no one had any money, and they were just driving through a bombed out continent, you know. Not all of them drove. A lot of riders in those days took their motorcycles around Europe in trains. That's how they got to the races, right? And sometimes pushed the motorbike from the train to the racetrack. I mean, you cannot believe how basic it was now. You go there now, and at a MotoGP race now in Europe, there are 185 juggernauts at each race. What do you call juggernauts in the States?
Like a tractor trailer, like a huge.
There's 185 of them required to make the paddock, right?
I've never heard them called juggernauts before.
Yeah.
I want to start saying that.
I
almost got run over by a juggernaut in the highway coming in this morning. Yeah,
exactly. It's a nice word. But yeah, so that gives you an idea. So they're team trucks, hospitality trucks, TV trucks, all that kind of stuff. So you go back to 1949, you've got a bunch of riders driving or taking the train around Europe. I mean, literally living in tents. Some of them barely able to afford to eat. You know, one of them told me that, you know, they had no money, and they used to get prize money to start the race. So if you fell off and broke your leg in practice, you wouldn't get any money unless you started the race. So they'd have the leg in a plaster, and they'd paint the plaster black and get somebody to start their bike for them, take it to the grid, start the race, and pull in after 200 yards or halfway around the first lap in agony. And they would then get the £20 or $20 or whatever it's start money, which would be enough money to get them fuel to drive to the next race. I mean, you cannot believe how basic it was then. And there wasn't a lot of factory involvement. Norton in Britain, HS in Britain, Gilera in Italy. The Germans weren't allowed to compete for the first few years because they started the Second World War. That was like, you can't come and play. We don't like you anymore. And
right. No start money, no prize money for you because of that whole thing you just started.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So was it all passion based then? Cause there wasn't really any money in it. So it was just like, it was based on just the thrill of getting to win a quote unquote world championship race or a European championship race or whatever the sort of context was at the time. And that was it.
Yeah, absolutely. People, I mean, I think it's still the same now, even though they're paid, the top riders are paid $10-20 million a year, but you couldn't do it unless you loved it. You know what I mean? I mean, they're still all doing it for the love. Obviously the money's great, but the thing that gets them out there is because they're addicted to that buzz, like all of us. That's why we ride motorbikes. We're addicted to that buzz, right?
Right.
So they're just the same as us, but just a bit crazier.
They're a lot faster. Yeah.
They're a bit better at it. Yeah.
So Matt, just so you're talking about, like, if you look at MotoGP now, 185 tractor trailer trucks / juggernauts showing up, like, but just paint the picture, and this is more for my edification than anything else. What do the tracks look like? Because I mean, are we talking about road racing tracks the way we have them now? Or are we talking about like racing in city streets, more like Isle of Man? Like, what did racing look like in these first couple of years?
It was pretty much perspective? Yeah, it was pretty much all street circuits. So racing around the streets like the Isle of Man. So they close the streets and off you go and you race around. And so there was Monza in Italy, which was a proper racetrack. But I'm just trying to think, from the first 1 or 2 seasons, I think they were nearly all street circuits, i.e. very dangerous. There were, all the way up until safety got better in the 80s, there were a lot of guys being killed. I mean, in the 50s, 60s, it wasn't unusual for, 10 riders to get killed in a Grand Prix, in a MotoGP season. So death was something that the riders just lived with. But again, because they love doing what they're doing, they were happy to live with that. Again, I've interviewed loads of them. They said, we just didn't think about it. Just shut it out. Don't think about it.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
It's so much different than society today. I think society today, we still, you hear the stories of Isle of Man. Every year it seems like there's, at least a tragedy that kind of comes to light. And there's a lot of people that are surprised that race is still running, but it definitely was much more acceptable, in the early days, where it was just kind of like, you board track, you mentioned board track racing in America. It's like, you might die. But it was a spectator sport that people were willing to come and watch, and participate in, knowing the risk. Whereas today, if there's any risk involved, there's usually some sanctioning body that's like, our insurance isn't going to cover that. So we're not going to let you do that.
Yeah, it's true. It's definitely true. Well, I just want to jump in quickly and say, we've brushed up against the topic of the Isle of Man a couple times. And we might do so again in this discussion, because the Isle of Man was in fact a world championship race for many years, for decades, as Matt will, I'm sure, tell us. But we're not going to dive into Isle of Man today. Just if you're jonesing for us to do that, we would love to have that conversation. We might even have that conversation with Matt, because he's very much, is extremely knowledgeable about that as well. But that's not something we're gonna dive into. So I'm just if you're listening and wanting that to happen, we want it to happen too. Trust us.
It's a whole subject of its own, the Isle of Man.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So I guess that's a great question about the tracks, and I'm interested to talk about the evolution of racing circuits and kind of like how because I think people might be surprised at how recently MotoGP competed on street circuits. But I'm interested in talking about the pivot in the era of the kind of 60s and into the 70s, where the bikes were, I would say, I mean, I want to get your take on this, Matt, but in my mind, the motorcycle racing the motorcycles, the machines themselves in the early to mid to even into the late 60s were pretty similar in design to those in the 50s. There were big single cylinder, air cooled 500cc, and then Honda, Japanese manufacturers, started making multiple cylinder motorcycles, 4 cylinders and 6 cylinders even. But then there was this whole revolution with the 4-stroke to 2-stroke. And I know that you have a famous book that's written that Spurgeon's holding up now called Stealing Speed, about this sort of this whole thing that happened, this revolution of 4-stroke engines being overtaken by 2-strokes. And I'm curious what your musings are on that, because that seems like a really pivotal time in technology.
Before you answer, I want the audience to know this is how I discovered Matt. Matt wrote an absolute fantastic book called Stealing Speed. I have the graphic novel version right here. Matt actually has, so the version that Matt, I was to say, so Stealing Speed, I have an original paperback copy that's at home in my personal library, but it's very expensive to find it on Amazon. So Matt, you had mentioned that it's actually being reprinted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm just doing a reprint, expecting the books in my garage in a couple of weeks. But anyway, I'm not.
No, but if you're listening to this on the podcast, it's a great holiday gift for a stocking stuffer out there. So that's it's an absolutely fantastic book, Matt. Very well written, and it's how I became familiar with your work.
Okay. It's an amazing story. It's a true life story. But yeah, so, I mean, the important thing I think to say about Grand Prix racing is that basically Grand Prix technology has led motorbike design from the beginning, right? Engineers, they switch to multiple cylinders, or they go from drum brakes to disc brakes. They go for steel chassis to aluminium chassis. All that happens on the racetrack to try and make the bikes go faster. Up the straights, around the corners, whatever, make them stop better, make them go faster. And then that technology arrives on the road some years after. And that was very much the same with the switch from 4-stroke to 2-stroke. Suddenly 2-strokes, for various reasons explained in that book, 2-strokes kind of took over. I mean, why did 2-strokes take over from 4-strokes? Well, it's all in the name. With a 2-stroke, you get one power stroke, one power pulse per 2-stroke to the crankshaft. Whereas a 4-stroke, you get one power pulse for 4 strokes to the crankshaft. So you're basically getting double the power out of a 2-stroke. I mean, it's not quite that much because for various reasons I won't go into now. But so from a racing point of view, you got certainly 50 to 75% more power, certainly 50%, and they're lighter and smaller and easier to maintain and so on. So they're just a perfect racing engine. And that's why they took over. And then as a result of them taking over on the track, they kind of took over on the road as well. So you had, Yamaha RD 250s, 250LCs, Suzuki GT 750s, 3-cylinder 752 strokes and Yamaha, even Honda started building 2-strokes, because they had to. Honda hates 2-strokes, but they had to. So there's always that evolution that the racing leads the road, and that's one of the great things about it,
Yeah, I was just going to say for the audience that might be listening to this, and you're trying to grasp the 2-stroke, 4-stroke difference. An easy way to think about this is if you're in your garage, you might have a 2-stroke, weed whacker. If you have to mix oil in your gas, that's a 2-stroke engine. And then if you're just putting gas in with a separate oil tank, that's a 4-stroke design. That's obviously very simplified, but to kind of help you picture what we're talking about. Matt, can you just, I don't want to give the book away, but really the story that you wrote around Ernst Degner and Stealing Speed does really kind of show how that 2-stroke technology came out of World War II, and then why and how the Japanese got a hold of it. Give us the 2-minute version of the book, why somebody would want to read it, and how that story is, did have such a huge effect on motorcycle racing. Sure.
It's my one sentence answer is about explain it to me, and it's a true James Bond story with motorbikes, Walter Carden, he was working on Hitler's secret weapons program at the end of the war, and after the war he stayed in East Germany as it was then, and he loved motorbikes and started tuning motorbikes, and they only had rubbish little 2-strokes in Eastern Europe. They were very poor, they had no money, and he tuned these things and they got faster and faster and faster, and eventually they started winning races, and his little factory MZ, which was nothing compared to Honda, like 100th of the size of it. This is early 60s. He was beating the Hondas. So the other Japanese factory, Suzuki, for example, went, wait, hang on, we make 2-strokes and our 2-strokes are so slow. So let's steal this technology, basically, off the East Germans. And that's what the Japanese did. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese motorcycle industry just rocketed after that. So it's a fantastic story because it's motorbike racing, it's history, it's technology, it's politics. It's just this collision of this whole thing, you know. I was just very lucky to be the first guy that kind of thought, wow, I need to write a book about that, you know.
Right. It's an interesting, I mean, it's fascinating for a whole number of reasons. One thing that's worth calling out, I think, is that if you're familiar with the idea of 2-stroke versus 4-stroke engines, it might surprise you that 2-strokes have been around for a long time. I mean, they made 2-strokes in the, I don't know when, 20s, 30s, maybe before that, from the beginning. So, but this is the story of the guy that figured out how to make them so potent and strong and fierce, and extract all the performance out of this 2-stroke engine instead of a 4-stroke engine. And because of the times that they were all living in, it's this, like you said, this sort of collision, this mashup of geopolitics and competition and that kind of thing. One thing that I get a kick out of, if you can put it that way, is that it shows how important it was to everybody, right? I mean, there were people who took major risks, serious life risks, in the sort of James Bond sense, as you put it, to get this technology and to make motorcycles go faster, which in some ways, even as a motorcycle enthusiast, almost feels silly because it's just motorcycle racing, which ultimately in the world doesn't feel that important, but it was important.
But it was in the middle of the Cold War, right? So everything had this angle of like, we have to do everything better than the other side. Otherwise we might not be seen as powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is an amazing story and it just had such a huge effect. I mean, you know, some of my greatest memories as a young, I mean, why don't we have 2-strokes anymore? Pretty much you just don't see or hear 2-strokes anymore in motorbikes because, they emit more pollution. Certainly the older ones did. And so they basically got just, legislated out of existence by the whole kind of emissions regulations, which started in California in the 1970s, I think. You had a lot of, probably smog in LA and so on. I think that's where it all started. And people were like, hey, we need to do something about cleaning up the air, you know. So that's basically why, with a few exceptions, you just don't see 2-stroke motorbikes anymore. But
I was going to say the one exception for the audience listening, if you are somebody that rides off-road, 2-stroke motorcycles are still seen in the off-road community. But to Matt's point, if we're talking about on-road racing, which is really what MotoGP is addressing here, because those bikes can't be produced for street use, they won't pass emission standards.
I really miss 2-strokes. I mean, I used to race them for a while and rode them on the road. And there's just a lovely thing about a 2-stroke, you know, a lovely thing. I see why they had to get rid of them, but I do miss them.
Not if you're the slower guy and you're stuck behind the faster guy and you're just breathing in all that 2-stroke smoke.
I don't know. I kind of even like the smell, to be honest. But on the topic of 2-strokes, and back to this sort of timeline, this chronological timeline that we're following, it feels to me, in my mind's eye, as a motorcycle racing enthusiast, as I've been since I was a kid, when 2-strokes took over in the 70s, and keep in mind, everyone, just a quick sidebar, the rules stated a 500cc limit. So this is why 2-strokes took over, because brands were making 500cc engines as fast as they could, and then the 500cc limit was applied to 2-strokes. And as Matt pointed out, with the same amount engine size, the same amount of displacement in the engine, you can get a lot more power with a 2-stroke. So brands started having bikes that were much, much faster, with the same size engine.
So there was no like split at this time. It wasn't like, there wasn't limits where 2-strokes had to be limited.
Nope. That only happened later.
Yeah. The 500cc Premier class capacity limit went from 1949 until 2001. So you could race any kind of engine you wanted as long as it was 500cc, and a 500cc 2-stroke is faster. So 500 2-strokes won every 500cc world championship from 1976 to 2001. And then they changed the rules because 2-strokes weren't being sold on the road anymore. So they were like, well, there's no point racing them anymore. So in 2002, they went to 4-stroke 990cc, 4-strokes, which made about 220 horsepower. Now with MotoGP, with 1000cc four strokes, we're up to about 300 horsepower.
So basically so if I'm understanding this correctly, up until 2001, there were no rules two-stroke versus four-stroke. It was just a 500cc limit. Yep. But because there was no one that was going to get a four-stroke at 500 cc's to perform at the same power as a two-stroke.
Exactly.
Everybody just made two strokes because that's the only way they could win.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, the last four strokes to race was, I think, in 1976, everyone knew that the game was up. There was just no point, go and get yourself a two-stroke or go home, basically.
Right. And to your point, Spurge, they didn't ban four strokes. They were just practically banned because you could never win with a 500cc four stroke against a 500. And that I guess a quick sidebar would be the Honda NR, right, Matt? The Honda did, as Matt says, Honda historically as a company has not liked two strokes. And even tried, I think it was the late 70s, early 80s that Honda built the NR 500, which was a technically a 500cc four-stroke engine that they were hoping to sort of like get around the rules and make a bike that would be faster, but it didn't work.
Yeah, it was an insane machine. It had oval-shaped pistons, 8 valves per cylinder. I mean, most motorbike engines now, sports bikes will have 4 valves per cylinder, even now, 50 years later, pretty much. It had 8 valves per cylinder, 2 conrods per piston. Revved to like over 20,000 RPM, and it was pretty much impossible to ride. It was a nightmare. Honda spent, billions of yen on the thing, and it never even scored a single world championship point. It was.
Did you ever get to ride one?
I got to ride. It's kind of the son of NR 500, which was the NR 750 endurance bike that they race at Le Mans. I was actually supposed to ride it at Le Mans, but I didn't in the Le Mans 24 hour. But I turned down because it's a long story anyway. I turned it down. I don't regret that at all anymore. God. Yeah.
Well, so I guess, to get back to, we got kind of sidetracked there, which is mostly my fault, but in my mind's eye, the two-stroke, when the two-stroke era began, it really changed the dynamic of racing, and the bikes went from being kind of, at least, with some exceptions over the course of the history up to that point, similar to road going bikes. And at that point, they really started to change into these like pretty wild prototypes and factories. At this point, you mentioned that factories, that the motorcycle manufacturers in the early days weren't really involved, but by this point they were getting very, very involved, and people were spending a lot of money to, when I say people, companies were spending a lot of money to have the best, fastest motorcycle on the grid and the best, fastest rider in their colors. And to me, this is when the MotoGP World Championship kind of pivoted and turned into this really glorious place and became especially competitive and interesting. But is that true in your estimation? Or?
Yeah, I think it also was part of the Japanese taking over MotoGP. Basically, the Japanese factories just left everyone behind with their two strokes. So you had Yamaha, then Suzuki, Kawasaki, Honda, and they were they basically 100% dominated MotoGP from the latest 70s until the last 5-6 years. It was just a wholly Japanese sport. There'd be one Italian manufacturer finishing, well, maybe winning the occasional race. But the Japanese industry was obviously very, very wealthy because it was basically supplying motorcycles to the whole world. And so the Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki just was spending more and more and more money trying to beat each other. It became, the MotoGP title is the most important championship in motorbikes. It's the Formula One of motorbikes. So from a marketing point of view, and also from a teaching your engineers, that's what a lot of the factories use MotoGP for, is to go and educate their engineers, right? You go and work at MotoGP because you're in the kind of white heat of competition then, right? Everything you do is 100% judged on Sunday afternoon. There's no doubt whether you got it right or wrong. There's the result. You did great. You did rubbish. Go back to Japan and start again,
And Matt, just to be clear too, like Japan wasn't as predominant at the start, right? Like there were for a while there, I know a lot of the Japanese firms couldn't compete, had kind of dropped out, and they started coming into prominence. But before that, it was the European brands like MV Agusta that were kind of holding all of those championships to their name, to the point where now, like, I think, a lot of those brands still talk about how many world championships they had, and some of them even put stickers on their gas tanks when they're trying to sell motorcycles.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about MV Agusta, who basically dominated Grand Prix racing from the 50s until the 70s. Basically, they were the only factory that was taking it seriously. So they just won everything. And you'd have privateers on, self-financing riders on Norton singles racing against 4-cylinder MV Augustas. So you got 50 horsepower and the MV guys got 85, 90 horsepower. I mean, you got those two bikes in the same race. It was pretty crazy, really. And you also had, Norton, Gilera, MV Agusta. But yeah, it changed very much when the Japanese came in, and then more money, then sponsorship money came in. The next big change was the kind of 80s when, people got together and sorted out the TV, right? So if you wanted to broadcast the whole world championship on your TV channel in the States or wherever, you would have to go and negotiate with every country, the promoters of every race. You'd have to go speak to the Brazilians. You'd have to speak to the Japanese. You'd have to speak to the British. So that was obviously a nightmare. No one's going to run the whole championship. No one's going to televise the whole championship like that.
Right.
So they got it all together and made it into a package. So literally you just went and bought that, and then you have the rights to the whole championship. You could put on every race on your TV channel. And then obviously once that happened, all the sponsorship started coming in, because suddenly it was a good marketing platform. And to begin with, it was very much, tobacco money, big cigarette companies. They were just throwing money at motorsport, especially, so you had Marlboro, Rothmans, Lucky Strike, Camel. I mean, basically for 2 decades, the MotoGP grid looked like a tobacco shop, basically. It was kind of every brand was there, and they spent so much money. The parties were really good in those days because the cigarette companies, they had so much money to spend, they didn't know how to let's have a party. Okay, let's have a party. So that was good times. Yeah, interesting.
I know that we want to pivot, Zach, and so I'm gonna let you pivot into maybe a little bit of the split that we saw, the dawn of World Superbike. But before we do that, I want to take a quick break to get in a word from our sponsor, and then we will be right back with Matt to get into the next generation of MotoGP as it evolves.
Okie doke. We're back talking MotoGP with Mat Oxley. And at this point, that conversation about, tobacco money and sort of conglomeration and media and how it became a global sport, I think is an interesting juxtaposition to, in my mind, what was happening with the motorcycles, which was by the anytime in the 80s really, but especially to me, by the time we got to the late 80s or early 90s in the 500cc World Championship, or MotoGP as it was, the premier class was 500cc V4 two-strokes making 180, 200 horsepower. They were very light. They were very difficult to ride. They were famously fickle. And they were not really related to road bikes anymore. Right? They had separated from that. And perhaps because of that, there was this dawn of a World Superbike Championship where someone decided, well, we'll take road bikes that people can buy and everyone can modify those and race those. And that's completely different from Grand Prix racing, which is these two strokes that no one can buy and are totally exotic and wild. I guess I don't want to make this a World Superbike podcast because it's not. We're talking about MotoGP. But do you think that that had any effect on the Grand Prix paddock or the Grand Prix world, Matt? Or do you think that was just sort of a natural branch to spring off of the racing tree because it was needed?
Yeah. I mean, World Superbike actually came from America, basically. In the 70s, you guys were racing street bikes. I think basically the way you went racing at that time was, it had to be a street bike. You weren't allowed to race a race bike. It was basically,
and through the 80s as well.
Yeah. So, started in 76, and the guy that won the first ever Daytona Superbike race in 1976 on a BMW twin, believe it or not, was a guy called Steve McLaughlin. And he kind of became pretty big in the sport. Once he retired, he was team manager for Honda in the US and stuff. And then he was like, right, I want to make superbikes into a world championship. So he made that happen in the late 80s, 1988. And Honda, and the superbike championship had a huge effect on, we're not going to go too deep into superbikes, but it had a huge effect on road bike design because, Honda came out with the RC30 in 1988 specifically for, the superbike series. So suddenly, if you look at the way road bikes went, you look at things like the Fireblade, the Ducati 916, the Suzuki GSXR, the Kawasaki Ninja, all these things, companies were starting to make their sports bikes into kind of superbike race bikes, race bikes for the road, and that's carried on. I mean, it's got to a ridiculous state now where you've got a Panigale V4, which costs like $40,000 or something for the base model, but yeah, so basically it has had a huge effect on road bike design because it's forced the manufacturers to make more and more race bred motorbikes. Because if you, and that's why Honda have been not very good at superbikes for a long time because they just won't commit. Well, they kind of have actually, but they're still not doing well. But they won't commit and make a full-on race bike like Ducati have, That's why Ducati wins everything. And the BMW as well is kind of like that as well. And they kind of dominate for that reason. They're basically just race bikes on the road, with headlights.
If you're listening to this at home and you just want to try and get this in the most layman terms possible, MotoGP is basically like a prototype. You can't buy a MotoGP bike. A lot of the DNA of a MotoGP bike doesn't necessarily trickle down to the bike you can buy on a dealership floor. But when we start looking at World Superbike, in order to race a World Superbike, it has to come from a bike that you can actually go out and purchase. Is that pretty much a good delineation for the audience?
Yeah, that's a good delineation. Okay. And as Matt says, it changed the landscape of street bikes a lot because manufacturers started making street bikes so that they would be good race bikes for this World Superbike thing. And I guess maybe to put a finer point on it, Matt, do you think that MotoGP 500cc championship suffered a little bit because of that? Because Ducati in the 90s focused on World Superbike, and arguably, Kawasaki focused on World Superbike, right? Kawasaki wasn't racing in Grand Prix 500cc two-stroke Grand Prix racing then, and neither was Ducati, and neither was So I guess, do you think that MotoGP or the Grand Prix Championship suffered because of World Superbike because resources went elsewhere and they could focus on that because they thought it was better for sales or whatever?
Not so much resources, but from a fan point of view, yes. During the 1990s, MotoGP was ruled by one rider, from the 94 till the end of the 90s by one rider, Mick Doohan. He won 5 championships in a row and generally just took off and left everybody miles behind, which isn't very exciting. You woke up on Sunday morning knowing who was going to win the race. It was like, who's going to finish second today? No one wants to watch that really, do they? I do, but a lot of people don't. They want to see a battle. Whereas at the same time, you had in World Superbike, you had British guy Carl Fogarty, American guy Colin Edwards, Doug Poland, Japanese riders, European riders, and they were just tearing each other to pieces on Ducatis, Hondas, Kawasaki's. The racing was fabulous, and it sounded great as well because you had the sort of screaming Japanese 4-cylinder bikes, and you had the big booming Ducati twins. So it looked great, it sounded great, and it was a better show than MotoGP, and that's one of the reasons, not only reason, why MotoGP went to 4-strokes, because they wanted to steal World Superbike's thunder, right? They knew that if they went to 4-stroke, because 2-stroke Grand Prix bikes, unless you're a connoisseur of racing, they sound like scooters, right? Now, ning, 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 ning. They don't sound like, excuse the expression, real men's motorbikes. You know what I mean? They don't sound,
sure.
Most people expect a motorbike to roar or to boom. They don't expect it to go ning, 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 do they? It's kind of,
We should have had you do that when we were trying to explain to the audience what a 2-stroke is. We could have you make engine sounds.
Ning, 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 instead of vroom, vroom, vroom. Yeah,
we should do an engine sound guessing game where we just have Matt mimic the sounds of different engines, and then people can try and guess what he's doing.
I've got a friend who can do that really well, and he'll do them going down around the racetrack. So up shifts, down shifts, and all that kind of stuff.
That's funny. Yeah. So that's an interesting, it's a good way to put it. And I was young enough then. I don't think I really understood the nuance of what made racing good, so that's certainly good perspective. And I think that's also an interesting pivot into the return of four strokes, because that is, I think, a little bit of that was a more confusing shift. I think, when two strokes took over, it was because the technology was better. No rules had really changed. The technology just overtook four-stroke technology, and two strokes became kings of the class, and that was that. But the two-stroke pivot back to four strokes was much more confusing, because essentially they tried to do math and say, okay, well, we'll have a 990cc four-stroke with a four-cylinder limit. Or no, there wasn't even a cylinder limit, was there? And then that will be approximately the same speed as a two-stroke 500. And then they will race against each other briefly. Was it 1 year or 2 years they raced? It was 2002.
Yeah. There was only one season when they raced together. I mean, the big reason for the switch to four strokes was a marketing decision, right? So we're selling four strokes, so let's race four strokes. And that kind of, so from 1949 to 2001, there was no change in capacity. It was 500cc. In 2002, it went to 990cc four strokes. In 2008, it went to 800cc four strokes because they decided the 990s were too fast. Then in 2000, the 800s created very boring racing. So in 2012, we went to 1000cc four strokes. And in 2027, because they're too fast now, they're doing 226 miles an hour. Right? They're racing each other elbow to elbow at 225 miles an hour. I mean, it's insane. So they're going to 850cc in 2027 to try and slow the bikes down again. So it's a lot of it, everything is marketing now, right? Everything is business now, right? Racing now, obviously there's technology in it, a massive amount of technology in it. They're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, it is so high tech now. It's insane. But the people in charge are constantly all they care about basically is making a show. It's an entertainment show, right? So the people in charge, the engineers want to go off and go down their little weird rabbit holes of like downforce aerodynamics and all this kind of stuff. Whereas the guys who actually own the series are like, no. We want the racing to be really close. We want it to be entertaining. So more people turn on their tellies and we make more money, So you've got this constant, push and pull between the engineers and the salesmen, basically, and the salesmen, I think quite rightly, are becoming more and more important, because although there's a lot of technology in MotoGP, I mean, a crazy amount, as I say, the technology is kind of less important now, I would say, as in its transfer to road bikes, because, I mean, road motorcycles, when did you last ride a bad road bike?
Well, I think it's important. Yeah.
A new model, and you thought this is rubbish. I mean, you just never ride one anymore.
The quality has come so far from even when Zach and I started. I think for the audience listening, that might be, and Matt, for your kind of intro to the Highside, Lowside audience, we have a wide range of people that are just, maybe they don't even ride motorcycles yet. They're motorcycle curious, to people that are, 30, 40 year, riding veterans, like yourself. And I think it's important to note, just because there might be younger or newer riders that don't understand, if you go to a motorcycle dealership now, you can buy an entry level $4,000 or $5,000 motorcycle that has anti-lock brakes, that has traction control, that has electronic fuel injection and ignition and all this stuff that it's just become commonplace. So, Zach's point earlier, the last of the two-stroke generations were motorcycles that had no safety innovation, right? It wasn't electronic traction controls and all these things. Right. And so just in a span of 20 years, motorcycles went from an engine and a frame and wheels and who could tune it the best mechanically to computer technology taking over. And could you imagine riding some of these new Grand Prix bikes without any of that technology on them?
It would be, racing a 300 horsepower motorcycle without traction control would be quite interesting. That's
a very diplomatic way to put it.
That's a classic British understatement.
So I mean, I always think, like I say, it's this constant push and pull between technology. You know, if you try and get rid of some of the technology to make the racing closer and more entertaining and make the bikes more kind of violent so you can see the riders trying to control them. If you say we need less technology, some fans say, no, it's all about technology. We want technology. But if you have too much technology and that makes the racing boring for whatever reason, then a lot more people say, why is the racing so boring? You know, I don't want to watch it anymore. And to me, the one thing it needs to be is entertaining. It needs to be fun. I mean, I can watch a boring race because I'm a nerd and I love it all. I can watch a boring race and still enjoy it. But 90% of fans want to see a battle. They want to see a fight between riders, right. You know, just bashing hell out of each other, you know, which is what I love right. to see as well. You know, I mean, to me, right. it's kind of war, you know, motorbike racing. Right. It's a very vicious, brutal, kind of ugly sport, really. I mean, if you watch it, it's a beautiful ballet, but actually if you're on the track riding around, racing each other, it's vicious, it's ugly, and it all looks quite easy and smooth from the side. But actually when you're on the bike, it's not. You're just fighting the machine and you're fighting the other riders, and, you know, right. It's kind of, yeah, that's why we love it.
What was the Hemingway quote that you were talking to us about earlier?
Right. Okay. So Ernest Hemingway, famous novelist and author, American guy, he said there are only 3 sports: mountaineering, bullfighting, and motor racing. The rest are mere games. And I'm 100% with that. I hate bullfighting, but you know, so what he was basically saying was that, motorbike racing and mountaineering, let's forget mountaineering, we're here to talk about motorcycle racing, car racing, you know, they're deadly sports, right? You know, it's still quite easy to die on a motorbike if you're racing it.
Right.
And that, to me, that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating, because the people doing it, the psychology involved is just amazing. You know, these guys are going out there, they're warriors, basically. They're getting suited up in their kind of warrior gear, their helmet and their leathers, and they're going out and they're fighting a war with the other riders. And that is quite interesting. You know, it's not, and if they mess up, they're not going to trip over and maybe break a toe or, you know, break an ankle. You know, the very worst could happen. And that right. brings a completely different dynamic to everything. And I find racers' brains very interesting, you know, because there's a lot of self-delusion going on in a racer's brain. It's not going to happen to me. It's never going to happen to me, right? It's going to happen to the other guy. Right. It's not going to happen to me. Right. So there's all these kind of, you know, I could go on just about this for hours, but anyway.
No, I think it's a good pivot away from the machines and maybe a conversation about the people behind the handlebars.
Sure. I agree. Just to interject something quickly, I've always thought it was interesting. I as a kid, I played team sport. I played basketball. I played soccer. I played baseball. I played sports like normal kids do. And then as a teenager, I started racing motorcycles. And one thing I've always thought was fascinating about racing motorcycles, and maybe you can speak a little bit to this, Matt, is that you have this breakdown between your brain and your body in some way where you can tell yourself you want to go into a corner faster. I'm just going to brake later. I'm just going to lean over more. I'm just going to go faster through that turn. But it's not like saying, oh, I'm just going to shoot the basketball from farther away from the hoop. You can just do that if you want to. You can just shoot from half court, shoot from the other side of the court. There's no psychological barrier there. But when you're going into a corner at 100 and something miles an hour and you tell yourself, I'm going to wait an extra 20 yards or 30 yards before I hit the brakes, sometimes you literally can't do it. You can't get your body to do that. You can't tell it to do that because you have this piece of, we have this piece of our brain, our human brain, which says, no, you have to get on the brakes. You have to touch the brakes. You have to do that. And that, I think, is alive and in all of us, but maybe especially in MotoGP racers. And one of the fascinating things is that they're able to beat that, right? They're able to push themselves more than any other person is and successfully get through the corner without falling off. And I guess I'm curious what you think about that piece of the psychology.
No, absolutely. It as you say, it's easy to say, right, I'm going to make half a second going into that corner next lap. And,
Right.
you know, and you're going into that corner and there's one part of you going, yeah, I'm going to do it. And there's another part of you going, holy hell. No, you're not, you know, cause we're going to die,
Right.
you know, or we're going to break a leg or whatever, you know, and it is that basic, a kind of decision-making process. And yeah, I mean, all professional motorbike racers, even good non-professional motorbike racers, are very good at balancing that, you know, some people think people want to go racing because of the risk. They're risk junkies, adrenaline junkies. And that is very true in a way, but it's not the risk that appeals to you. It's controlling that risk. It's taking the risk and using your skill and your bravery and your knowledge and your know-how to control that risk, to take a risk that any normal person would take and they would crash. And you, because you've got the skills that you've learned over years and years and years, you can go through that corner at that speed and get away with it. And when you come out of the corner and you've got away with that risk, that's when you get the buzz, you know?
Right.
And obviously when you're talking about MotoGP, these are the 20 or so best riders in the world. There's no doubt about that. And even though what they do might look fairly easy from the outside, it really isn't from the inside. And, you know, the kind of techniques that they're using and the way they ride motorbikes is not like you and I ride a motorbike. You know,
right.
They are doing so many weird tricks. And, you know, the detail now with all the bikes have obviously got data recording. So they record like 500 channels of 500 sensors all over the bike, recording 500 channels of information. And, you know, the rider or the engineer will say, well, you can, going into this corner at 140 miles an hour, you can use another 1 bar brake pressure at 40 degrees of lean angle, right? To find a tenth of a second, you can do that. So when you're going into this corner, you've got to think about when you're at 40 degrees of lean angle, using another bar of brake pressure at that point. You know what I mean, that just blows me away, you know, that they're actually thinking 100%. And they're thinking about that stuff every corner. You know, okay, I've got to do this at that corner. You know, they ride in different ways for different corners. And, you know, it's, like I say, it's to me, it's been a lifelong, well, I've been covering MotoGP for 37 to 38 years, whatever. That still fascinates me, that whole process of what these guys and the way it is now, it's so much more detailed than it used to be. You know, how the depth of data and know-how and knowledge that they're going into, you know.
Well, even what
the
you're
competition
there. Sorry,
what's that?
I was going to say even what he was describing was that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you were talking about how, you know, the first Argentine Grand Prix, there were 9 starters and 3 finishers and the leader won by 4 laps, you know, like that has over the course of the decades of MotoGP, of motorcycle world championship racing, it has shrunk down. I mean, when was the last time a race was won by more than a lap? I mean, it's been
decades.
It's been decades and decades, right? And now it's like it's seconds or a few tenths or something.
Yeah. I mean, generally, most, I think, races are won by between 1 or 2 seconds. It's not a lot, you know, and the top 10 might be covered by 15 seconds. So it's very intense. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it now. I would have loved to be a Grand Prix rider 20, 30 years ago. Not now. It's too intense. too crazy.
That was my question was, you know, you talked about, you know, a couple of segments ago, we were talking about like the tobacco parties and, you know, there's big money and, you know, racers would go out and have a party the night before, have a party the night of, and, you know, they'd go out and race some motorcycles and, you know, the winner was the most talented. And now, you know, you're talking about an extra bar of brake pressure and you're talking about, you know, you can measure 40 degrees of lean angle and it's much more scientific. And, you know, the racers, you know, are on a, you know, diet regimen and they're, you know, running and exercising and, you know, what's the shift that you have seen? We've talked about the shift in motorcycling. What's the shift that you've seen over the past 37, 38 years in the actual riders themselves?
Yeah, they've become, I mean, when I'd started late 80s, so you had Eddie Lawson there, Wayne Gardner, Wayne Rainey, Kevin Schwantz. It was already becoming, you know, they had to train. We'll go back to the 60s, 70s. Most of them probably barely trained, you know, might go for a jog every day or whatever. But, you know, but it always happens in steps. One guy comes in and he's trains harder than all the others. And the other guys are all like, oh, hell, I got to go out and train harder, and then another 3-4 years later, somebody else comes in, and Eddie Lawson was one of the big ones. He really stepped up the training, because riding a Grand Prix bike for 45 minutes is incredibly physically and mentally stressful. I mean, if I the last time I rode a Grand Prix bike or a race bike was probably like 10 years ago, and I was exhausted after 2-3 laps, absolutely exhausted, mentally and physically after 6-7 minutes, So Mick Doohan was the next guy, Australian guy in the 1990s to really step up the training. And so now, they are all 100% athletes. Most of them don't drink. All of them are pretty much teetotal. Apart from maybe a swig of champagne at the end of the race, if they're lucky enough to win. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they train every day for 5-6 hours, running, gym, riding dirt bikes, or, in circles. It never stops, so, and the rest of the paddock is kind of getting like that as well. I mean, it used to be a bit of a party, back when I started, there would always be a big party on Sunday night in some rider's motorhome or in the nearby bar or wherever. And it was that kind of celebration, in the 60s and 70s, the party on Sunday night would be a celebration of still being alive.
Right. We cheated death. Yeah.
And by the 80s, it was still, we cheated breaking a leg or whatever, not many people were getting killed by then, but it would be that release of energy, so you're under massive stress and pressure all week, or, physically and mentally all weekend. And then Sunday night, hey, let's go and have a good time. Let's kind of, that's our reward for having, been through this incredibly stressful 3 days. Now that doesn't happen very, very rarely, so, I mean, because the more scientific it becomes, the more money that gets involved, the more athletic the riders becomes, it all becomes from the inside a bit more boring. Nobody's got time to have any fun anymore. Not even the mechanics. There's no fun anymore. Unless you're a journalist, you can still go out and have a bit of fun because you're just watching, right? And then writing about it, you're not actually doing anything important. Like a mechanic, is doing up. Mechanic can't have a hangover. He's doing up the front brakes on a 220 mile an hour motorcycle. That's a pretty. I mean, that's stress, right? I mean, the riders have stress.
Task.
Yeah, the riders have stress, but the mechanics and engineers have it as well. It's a big deal.
Well, I've tried talking to family members about this, and I think even people listening to this that maybe have never done a track day, let alone a race. I remember my first time, doing a track day and thinking, oh, I'm only going to the sessions are only 15 minutes. That's not enough time. I want to be out there for half an hour at a time. And after your first 4 or 5 laps, you're like, oh my God, my knees are cramping up, your back, you're so physically exhausted. And I think for non-riders or for people that have never done a track day, the physical exertion of trying to ride these motorcycles for 15 minutes at a time, let alone 45 minutes at a time, I don't think the average person probably understands how physically intense it is.
No, I don't think anyone pretty much, apart from the riders, well, the people involved in the sport do, obviously, but the thing is, the better the bikes get, the more demanding they become to ride because there's more grip. There's brakes are better. There's more acceleration. There's more braking power. There's more grip. So there's more G-force going into the corner, more G-force going around the corner. So the riders are fighting against that all the time. I remember when carbon brakes, all the MotoGP bikes have carbon brakes now, which basically just are kind of way better than steel brakes. They're just like hitting a brick wall when you hit those things. But in the early 90s, when they were kind of fairly new, they used to take a while to get up to temperature. And I used to test Grand Prix bikes at that time. And I was testing Mick Doohan's NSR 500 at Catalunya, Barcelona, I think. And obviously, I'm a journalist. I'm not a racer anymore. So I'm going around probably the first couple of laps, not really fast enough, getting up to speed. And then I'm into it. Tires are warm. Let's go for it. Arrive at the first corner, go for the brakes, and they don't work at first because they're not up to temperature. And then, so you grab them harder and suddenly they come up to temperature in a bang. And the bike just does a stoppie at 100 miles an hour. And I got thrown over the handlebars, right? So thinking I'm dead, right? So because the G-force even then was that much. So I'm get thrown over the handlebars and I'm still holding the handlebars and I'm looking at the number plate the wrong way up, You know, my visor.
So your head's down by the front wheel now, but you're still on the bike.
Exactly.
Yeah,
okay. And in your mind, you're like, can I afford this bike if I don't?
No, exactly. I'm thinking, you're running, when you have those kind of moments, it all goes through your brain in like 500 miles an hour. Oh my God, I'm going to look the biggest idiot when I get back to the paddock and I've destroyed this £1 million motorcycle. And then obviously just through the position I was in, I obviously let go of the brake and it all kind of, somehow I landed back in place. But that gives you some idea of the G-force. And that was in the early 1990s. The brakes are way better now. I mean, they're getting towards 2G on the brakes now. So you're carrying double your body weight. You're locking yourself onto the bike with your wrists, with your excuse me, with your feet on the foot pegs and also your backside. You're jamming that into the back of the seat hump. So you're basically locking your body because otherwise you're just going to go flying over the front of the bike,
Right. And it's fair to say that this is you being surprised by how powerful brakes were. And you had raced at that point at the Isle of Man, at the 24-hour Le Mans. Like you were not a spring chicken when it came to race bikes. You understood how they worked. And yet it surprised you how vicious those brakes were.
Yeah. Carbon brakes were a big step forward.
I think that the thing that sometimes I tell people about, like, cause you said it looks kind of elegant when you ride around on a motorcycle. Or even you watch MotoGP and you think, oh, they're drifting through that corner and then they go into that corner and they slow down a little bit and then they accelerate out. And it's kind of lovely, at arm's length. But if you've raced at a international level like you have, or if you've raced at a club level like I have, or if you've gone to a track day like Spurgeon has, you know that when you're slowing down for a corner, it feels like panic. I mean, it's like if someone drove to the grocery store and every time you left a green light, you floored the accelerator and accelerated absolutely as fast as you can. And then every time you came to a red light, you just slammed on the brakes as hard as the car would slow down. I feel like that's an estimation of how
analogy
of the kind of like mental stress, the physical stress. Sure. Like you're accelerating quickly and you're slowing down quickly, which is, physically demanding, especially with a high performance vehicle, but it's also just mentally taxing to always be, slamming on the brakes or slamming on the accelerator all the time, but doing it like kind of as gently and as smoothly as you can so that you don't hurt yourself. But that's really what it's so violent. I think people don't realize that.
You guys were talking earlier about like just mentally trying to change your braking points, right? Like,
right.
That's not easy to do, to overcome those mental blocks. And obviously, I'm a track rider. The two of you are racers, and there's a difference there for sure mentally. But like for the average person, I remember the first time that I got coaching, and it's like I'm coming on the brakes on braking point 4, and the coach is like, "Hey man, you're not carrying enough speed. You can actually go faster, and you can like wait a braking marker." And I'm like, "No, I'm good." Like I try, but it takes session after session after session to just try and carry a little bit more speed and come on the brakes a little bit harder because mentally you're exhausted. You're just like, I can't, it's so many moving pieces and it's all happening so fast that when you're looking at these athletes, they are truly athletes. And I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, you're not an athlete because you're riding a vehicle. And that's, we hear this all the time. And it's like, no. Like this is so much more athletic than swinging a bat at a ball at times.
Yeah. And the kind of mental stress comes from, racing is all about riding a knife edge. If you want to win a race, you've got to go fast enough to beat all the other guys, but not too fast so you crash. And finding that zone, that little kind of knife edge, that kind of high wire, basically, you're on a high wire the whole time. You're trying to go as fast as you can, but not too fast. And, if you race, you crash all the bloody time. And that's just what happens with racing. in MotoGP, the top guys are crashing 20, 25 times a year, and everybody says, a lot of people now say, well, they've got amazing leather suits with airbags and amazing helmets and boots and leathers. And what I say to people that say that, I say, okay, so go and, get a set of Alpine Stars leathers or whatever, full race MotoGP spec, boots, gloves, helmet. Go and get your friend with a car and say, okay, climb onto his roof, go down the highway until you get about 80 miles an hour and then jump off, right? That's what crashing a MotoGP bike at 80 miles an hour is like, right? And please don't anybody do that. I don't want you to get hurt. And
we're going to have to have our lawyers review this episode now, Matt. Thanks for that.
I don't want you to hurt, but even more importantly, I don't want to get sued. So that is what it's like. I mean, you're going from 3-4 feet in the air onto the tarmac at 80 miles an hour. So don't you know, when it comes up on the TV, somebody crashes, it says rider okay. He's not okay. Yeah. He's in a lot of pain. He might not be, he's still alive and he's not broken a leg, but he's not okay. And, you know, these guys are crashing like that once or twice a weekend, you know? So it's a very brutal, and they're crashing more and more because the racing's getting tighter and tighter. So you have to take more and more risks. And you're not looking for a second anymore like they were 20, 30 years ago. You're looking for a 10th, even 100th, you know? You're looking at a 100th of a second at each corner, you know.
I have so much respect too. I think, you know, for you guys, you know, you're talking about racing motorcycles and crashing. I think for the average motorcyclist, you know, crashing a motorcycle is something that might be a once in a lifetime thing for them. You know, they're probably riding conservatively in the street. They're not expecting to ever crash a motorcycle. And, you know, even for myself, I remember the first time I low-sided a Ninja 400 at a racetrack. It was hard to come back from mentally. You know, every time you get to that corner, you're just like, you know, you mentally have to overcome the crash and you have to trust that like, it's not going to happen again. And so for the average person, the idea of crashing a motorcycle multiple times a year and then getting back on and riding through that same corner even harder. Yeah. I don't think most people can probably fathom what you're saying right now, Matt.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, we see that now in practice in MotoGP. You know, Marc Marquez will crash, which does happen quite often in qualifying. Say it's only a 15-minute session. You got to go out there and get the fastest lap you can to get on the front of the grid, and he'll crash. He'll jump on a photographer's scooter. You know, he crashed at 80, 90 miles an hour, big slam into the dirt and roll over and over and over and get up and get a scooter back to the garage, jump on his spare bike, go straight out without even sitting down and go like, you know, he's probably hurting a bit. It's not broken anything, and go straight out and go a tenth of a second faster. I mean, you know, how you mentally do that. I don't think there's anything else like it. I mean, obviously car racing is kind of similar, but you just don't have that kind of pain involvement, you know, in
or
car
exposure.
Racing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can still get hurt. I always say to people, it's very hard to get badly hurt in a car. It's very easily to get hurt on a motorbike, you know, I mean, and that's so true in racing. These guys are carrying injuries all the time. None of them are injury free ever. You know, they've got old injuries. They've got new injuries, you know.
Yeah. And you mentioned Marc Marquez, and I think it's a good point to note, you know, Matt, at the beginning, we introduced you as, you know, a podcast host in your own right. You do host a MotoGP podcast. I think for anyone listening that doesn't know who Marc Marquez is or who isn't familiar with the current lineup of motorcycle racers, you know, Matt, you know, you do have a podcast that might be of interest to people that, you know, want to get into knowing a little bit more about who the current class of riders are. But I do think it would be fun. And maybe that's something we can come back and Zach, maybe we can have Matt on again in the future where we're just talking about, you know, the upcoming class of riders and who are the top 5 riders to watch or something along those lines. But, you know, Americans in the sport, you know, just to kind of touch on this historically, we don't see a lot of Americans in MotoGP, and there have been historically, you know, you've mentioned some in passing, but like what happened? Why are there not Americans in the sport anymore, Matt? Like what was the era of Americans? Why aren't we doing this anymore? What's wrong with America?
Sure. Well, not so much what's wrong, but what's changed. And the reason the Americans came to the fore, which was the late 70s, King Kenny Roberts, Pat Hennon, and then Steve Baker, and then Freddie Spencer, Eddie Lawson, you know, Wayne Rainey, Kevin Schwantz, Kenny Roberts Jr. So Americans and Australians basically dominated MotoGP with the 500cc two-strokes from the late 70s until the end of the 1990s. So for 20 years, I think in like 21 years, all but 2 or 3 world championships were won by Americans or Australians. So that seems like crazy, right? Because there hasn't been one in the last nearly 20 years. So why did that happen? It happened for a very simple reason. The 500 two-strokes at that time, as we've already talked about, were very hard to handle. You kind of had to ride, you know, the engines were ahead of the tires and the chassis. So you had to kind of ride them out of control. And the Americans and Australians, unlike the Europeans, grew up riding dirt track. So they were used to being sideways. They, from 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they would be riding around on dirt ovals, getting sideways, you know, mastering all the skill that you needed to ride a bike basically out of control. And when they started coming to Europe, it was like, wow, they're riding in a completely different way. And because of that, they dominated all the way up until the late 1990s 1990s, by which time the motorbikes had evolved so much that they became easier to ride, which is a kind of, you shouldn't really say easier because they're still hard, but
we'll put the air quotes up for you. They're easier to ride.
Became easier to ride. and the Europeans who had grown up doing asphalt, not doing dirt track, could ride them again. And so there was no need to hire Americans or Australians anymore. And during that same period, Spain became the dominant country in motorcycle racing. And now their national championships, their kids championships, their national championships, their kind of junior international championships, the competition is so amazing that nowhere else in the world can get close to it. So basically, if you want to be a top motorbike racer now, your parents need to move to Spain when you're 5, right? And you get onto the Spanish racing ladder, because there's no other country in the world. It's the same with Britain. The tracks in Britain, like in America, are quite dangerous. So the riders aren't riding to that same level. I mean, the Spanish tracks are MotoGP spec, so they're super safe, loads of runoff. And basically in MotoGP, you ride till you crash. That's another reason they crash so often, because they are riding over the limit all the time, because you're never going to make it unless you do, So,
right.
So I've spoken to riders that raced in Britain and then went to race in MotoGP, and, their data guy saying, no, you've got to brake, what we were talking about just then. You've got to brake later for turn 1. And he's like, well, but I'll crash. And the guy said, it doesn't matter. If you crash to 170 miles, it doesn't matter. You'll be fine. 170 miles an hour, just go out and do it. Go out and smash those brakes 20 yards later than you do normally. And if you crash, you crash. And we'll work it out after that. I mean, that's the kind of level that these guys are at. And that's why the Americans and also the British are nowhere anymore, because we don't have that incredible racing base that the Spanish do. The Italians have one as well, but, it's mainly Spanish and Italian, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's also, it'd be fascinating to talk about that more, because it was such an interesting, like you said, such a broad and visible shift between, American and Australian, dominance, and then this sort of like, Mediterranean dominance. But I want to pivot quickly to the fact that an American company is buying MotoGP.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really have anything to do with American riders succeeding in MotoGP, but do you think that it's, so I guess first of all, for a quick bit of background, Liberty Media is an American company, and this company is investing in purchasing MotoGP, and with the hope to turn it into even bigger business and so on and so forth. I just think it's interesting that at a time when Americans are not present really in the MotoGP Premier Class World Championship, that an American company is investing in it. And I wonder if there's any connection there in your mind. Do you think that there'll be any more American interest because there's an American company, or do you think it's global business and that's the end of it?
I think it's a global business. Liberty Media, they bought Formula One, the
right.
open wheel car racing, the world's biggest car racing series. They bought Formula One for like $8 billion about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And they're now buying MotoGP for $4.2 billion. I don't think it's worth that much, but anyway, they're buying it for $4.2 billion. And, it's a business. They don't care where the money comes from as long as it comes. I mean, they have worked very hard to make Formula One bigger in the States and been very successful with it. You've now got a Grand Prix at Austin at COTA around a proper racetrack. And now you've got a race in Las Vegas around the streets. You've got a race in Miami around the streets. So they've been very good at making that happen. Also with their amazing documentary series called Drive to Survive. So we don't really know what they're going to do. I mean, obviously they want to make MotoGP bigger, which we all want, because we want it to be bigger because it's a great series and it would be great if more people watched it. But, it's a business deal. They obviously think that they can make MotoGP bigger than it already is and grow its value. I mean, it sounds awful, but that's basically all it's about, really.
Well, you made that comment earlier, Matt, and I think it's interesting because like you're talking about like the excitement of the race. There has to be something interesting for people to watch. Zach it was kind of a throwaway comment, but Zach talked about when he was growing up playing soccer, and soccer is football, as you would call it, Matt, is a sport that hasn't historically been super popular in the States, but over the past few years has definitely become more popular in the States and is huge in Europe. But when you think about why racing or MotoGP racing isn't as popular in the US, I think even for me personally, it's hard to watch. Like I can watch motocross racing because it's now on Peacock or NBC, whatever you want to call it. And you can watch it anytime and it's saved. Where with MotoGP, at least in the US, you can no longer just turn on the television and watch MotoGP racing. You have to have an app, and you have to then
a subscription
and download it separate from, if I have a subscription to Peacock, the family can sit around and watch other television programming. And then on Sunday, I can rewatch the motocross racing. So do we think that with Liberty Media buying this, if we could get easier access to watching the races, especially in the United States, and I'm not sure how you consume the racing in Europe if you do have it on the regular television channels, but it's definitely, I would say, a barrier to entry for the United States audience. And do we foresee Liberty Media making it easier to access on television?
I'm not sure, but basically, if you own a race series like Liberty do F1 or Dorna currently own MotoGP, about to sell it to Liberty, there's two ways of making money. You can put your series on free to air TV. So you just, like you say, you just turn on your TV and there it is. You don't have to pay a subscription. And that way you get a huge audience, hopefully. But where does the money come from? Because you're not getting any money from you're getting a little bit of money from the TV company. And, what you're hoping is that the extra exposure you get from having it free to air, as we say in England, is you're going to get more sponsorship coming in because they're like, wow, 1 million people are watching this on TV. We want to spend money there, Or you can do pay TV or subscription where you can charge the TV companies a huge amount of money because they're then charging all the fans money to watch it, right? So there's the two basic ways that you can make money out of racing. And Dorna it's the same in MotoGP is the same in Europe, pretty much everywhere. It's gone completely to pay TV. Like in Britain, you can't watch it. You've got to have TNT Sport or whatever. Even in Spain and Italy, you can't watch it on free to air TV. You've got to have a subscription. And so you get, like in the UK, when we had it on free to air on the BBC, there were like 1 million, 1.2 million people watching it. Now on pay TV, there's 200,000 probably. So the audience has gone down massively, but MotoGP is making more money out of it. So it's a real tricky thing to balance. I mean, I would obviously like it to be free to air because I want more people to watch it, but then it's difficult to kind of equate to sort of judge how much money you're getting into the sport through sponsors. And that's not a guaranteed thing. Whereas if if it's pay TV, you've got guaranteed income as the series owner. So that's the kind of, it's a tricky thing. Yeah. I mean, it's business, right?
Yeah. So I have a couple questions that I want to finish out with. First one comes to mind. What do you think? You said you interviewed riders that rode in that first season, 1949 season of MotoGP, or early motorcycle Grand Prix racing. What do you think they would make of what MotoGP has become in this era? Someone who has taken the train to a race and pushing their bike to the start line, riding around the streets of Bucharest or Barcelona or something like that with maybe a hay bale in front of a phone pole. Do you think they'd be, proud or overwhelmed, or do you think they'd think that it had lost some of the luster? Or what do you? I know that you don't have a crystal ball and you're not that person, but what do you think of that?
Well, funnily enough, one of the guys I interviewed who did that first season was a guy called Cecil Sanford. He won the 125 CG World Championship in 1952 or something like that. And he'd been there in 1949. And he came to the British Grand Prix at Silverstone a few years ago. Sadly, he passed away last year, I think, or 6 months ago or something like that. Lovely guy. But he, and I know lots of guys who've come much older who've come to races and they are pretty overwhelmed because it is just, literally they were in a grassy field fixing their motorbike in the mud, with a tent and I mean, really, and now it's all super shiny and super colorful.
Yeah,
exactly. And most of them are just like, holy hell, what? I mean, they're amazed. They're kind of bowled over by it. But without a doubt, a lot of the romance has gone out of it, that kind of sense of adventure, daring do, fun, has gone out of it because it's an incredibly important, incredibly high stress environment now. So it's
expensive
it's very expensive and it's quite sort of, I mean, I always say the paddock has kind of changed from being a global village to like a sort of shopping mall, because in the old, when I first did it, all the riders had little motorhomes or little camper vans, we call them in Europe. So they're tiny little motorhomes, probably no bigger than a big American car, and you're in there, you drive around Europe with your girlfriend or your mum and dad or whatever, and you stay in that.
Right.
So the whole paddock was like this fantastic little global village of all these people. Some would have their mums with them. Some would have their kids with them. Some would have dogs with them. They'd be doing Barbies outside their motorhomes and stuff. But then
that's the barbecue in American speak.
Yeah. Barbecue as the commercial side of racing got bigger, all these hospitality units that the sponsors wanted to have to entertain their guests and so on were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually they had to ban riders, apart from in the premier class, from having motorhomes. So it's gone from this amazingly fun, bustling kind of global village to this kind of quite sterile, sort of shopping mall, but you can get really nice food. so you can go into a hospitality unit and some of them are kind of, like nearly Michelin star kind of, I mean, if
there are 2 stories and
No, absolutely. Yeah, there's some of the hospitality units, they're made out of like 12, 15, 20, juggernauts or, what do you call them? Tractor trailers.
Right.
They're
Trucks.
huge. They take 2 days to put up and they took 2 days to take down. So all through the European season, they're building them, 2 days to build it. It's up there for 4 days, and then they take 2 days to take it down, and they drive it to the next track. They spend 2 days putting it up, 4 days at the race, 2 days they go to the next track. I mean,
that's a real juxtapose compared to like throw throw some charcoal in a grill and make some hamburgers and hot dogs for your friends.
Yeah. Big change.
Well, I have one more question. Spurge, you have any final questions? I just have one more I'd like to ask.
For those of you listening, it is getting dark where Matt is, so we're gonna try and wrap this up to give him a chance to go have some dinner. Zach, why don't you take a last question for Matt, and then we will play the engine sound guessing game with him.
Yes, please. I can't resist asking you this question, even though maybe it would be better for another podcast down the road, should we be so lucky. If you could change one rule in MotoGP, what would it be?
Great question.
Well, I would make the people who run the series in charge of the technical rules. So then they can adjust the technical rules to make the racing really good. At the moment, the rules are decided basically largely by the manufacturers, which is a bit like allowing the lunatics to run the asylum, right? So to me, the main thing is to have exciting racing, and therefore the rules should be written to have exciting racing. That's what I would do. Yeah.
Okay. I think good answer. Nice and succinct.
I think Liberty will do that as well because they know.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so you think they'll
will
try to control it more as a sanctioning body, decide on the rules rather than say like, what do you guys think we should do from a manufacturer's standpoint? Okay.
And the rules might be the rules, but they'll just come in and say, well, we own it now. So we're going to change them. And if you don't like it, see you later. Bye.
Do you have a specific rule in mind, like that you think would make it more interesting?
There's a lot. I mean, it's another big subject. Downforce.
Are you if you're waiting for Liberty Media to come and hire you as a consultant, you don't have to give away. Give away your answers.
I don't think they're going to do that. Downforce aerodynamics, they need to be reduced. We have these things called ride height devices. They need to be got rid of. Right. They need to reduce the electronics. They need to make the engines make more torque, more lower down power, and reduce the grip of the tires, to make the things more kind of a bit more out of shape so you can see the riders fighting with them. Because now the problem now is the bikes are too good. They're on rails everywhere. It looks like they look easy to ride. You watch them. Well, the guy's just riding around. Right. What's he doing? He's just riding around. But, so you need to get back to a bit more of that, I think,
Right. Reduced grip. This is what my dad's been saying for years. So he'll be 100%. Thrilled to hear you say that.
100%. 100%. Reduced grip.
All right. Well, for some reduced mental grip, we're going to pivot into the engine sound guessing game, whereby Spurgeon and Mr. Matt and myself, we're going to listen to an engine sound that has been provided by a listener. We have not heard this before. We're guessing right along with you. So as usual, if you know it, you're in your car by yourself, shout it out. Tell us we're stupid. That's fine. So let's all listen to the sound and see if we can figure out what it is.
If this turned out to be a pre-recorded sound of Matt just making engine sounds, I would be so excited for producer
Very impressed.
Chase.
I'd be very impressed. Yeah. All right. Here
This
we
could
go.
be embarrassing. I'll give it my best shot.
All right.
I'm going to start with a question. Did anyone find themselves wishing that they would have revved it a little bit more? Like,
Yeah, always. I always want more revs. You learn more the higher the revs go, I think.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I mean, I you kind of think, I know
how many
that.
cylinders?
I
How
know
many
it.
cylinders do you think, Matt?
I'd say that's a twin, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
First thing I think was, is it a BMW flat twin? And then
Right.
it could
That's
be
where
something.
my mind went.
It could, but it's too clean for that. I would say it's a Japanese V twin. It's not kind of throbby enough to be a BMW twin. I would say it's a Japanese
Okay.
V twin. I might say something like a Transalp or something, well, Africa twin or something like that.
So a
Something like
parallel
that.
twin.
Or-
Okay.
No, of course, I'm thinking of the old Africa twin, which was a V twin.
Oh, okay, you're thinking of an old V twin. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's a V twin. Is it? I don't know. I'm ashamed that I don't know.
Yeah, it does sound like it could be
No, I
like a
think
parallel
it's
twin as well. You think it's a V? I think that's a good guess. Let's get our first hint, Spurge.
Yeah,
the
let's do
first
it.
hint's
Let's do a
usually just
hint.
number of cylinders, and I think we're on the right track.
So we're all not on the right track.
Oh, you kidding me? Is it a V4?
It is a 90-degree V4.
Ah, okay. I wondered about that.
Oh man.
So could be like
embarrassing.
A VFR?
Could be a VFR. That's what you'd think.
could be. It sounds kind of like lopey and quiet and like not aggressive enough to be a VFR.
Well, let's play it.
does
Let's play it one more time
Okay,
for the
let's-
audience
sure.
before
Yep,
we
yep.
do hint number 2.
Okay, one more time.
Yeah, that. Am I allowed to talk now?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Doesn't sound like. I mean, obviously, whoever they know the bike, but it kind of doesn't sound like a V4 to me. But hey, what do I know?
They didn't rev it, man.
Yeah,
I know.
You're right. One is more because you hear the tick over, the mid range, and the
Right.
top power. They kind of all give you a different hint, don't they? You know.
So you know how the Ducati MotoGP bike as well as Ducati Panigales, they have that twin pulse
Yeah.
firing order, Matt, where instead of it being a classic V4 where the cylinders kind of go up independently, the pistons kind of rise and fall with each other on each side of the V, and it gives it almost like a twin kind of sound, even though it's a 4. And I'm wondering if any other company's ever done that besides, because that's obviously not a Ducati Panigale, or I'll eat my hat. But I'm wondering if another company's done that. All I can think of is like a Honda ST 1300 or Honda CTX 1300 that transverse V4.
Yeah.
And I don't really know much about the architecture of that bike, but that's the only one I can think of.
Yeah.
Another note too, just to kind of help us in this is, Zach and I have made comments in the past about like, I didn't hear a fuel pump click off there at the beginning. Like I didn't hear
Right.
that little fuel pump click in. We actually
So
had
it could be
we had a
older.
listener write in, Zach, and correct us because we've often talked about, oh, well, I heard a fuel pump, so it's not carbureted. And we had a listener write in who had an early Ducati and say, well, actually, I have a Ducati that has a fuel pump and carburetors. And while it's probably extremely rare, there are certain manufacturers that used a fuel pump to feed carburetors. So that's something else that
there you
we've
go.
never really considered.
Not fair enough.
I-
All right.
I
well,
didn't hear a fuel pump.
You talking about the big Honda? That kind of because it sounds very civilized, right? It doesn't sound at all rorty. It sounds so. The 1300. I think I've forgotten what they're called. Hideously ugly motorcycles.
The ST 1300 in America, anyway, and then also bike. Honda also had a big V4 that came out in that V4 adventure bike they only had for a couple of years.
Oh, well, that was VFR 1200.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
no. That engine, the VFR.
That same engine, but it was the whatever it was, it had a different name. Yeah. Okay.
I feel like there would have been a fuel pump if we would have heard that. I'm guessing maybe like a VFR 750, like an early 90s, late 80s VFR.
Well, none of us can come up with a V4 that's not a Honda, right? So, I mean, aside from Ducatis, which I don't think it's a Ducati V4.
What was the V4 was it the Magna? What was the V4 Cruiser that Honda ran?
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's true.
Was it also the VMAX Yamaha, but I don't think it's the VMAX Yamaha because it's not kind of, it doesn't sound lumpy enough, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't kind of sound performance oriented enough. Okay, so the closest we can get is a Honda V4, I guess.
Hint number 2.
Okay.
An early member of a first generation V4 series introduced in 1982. So what we're hearing right now
is an
early
of some sort.
Yeah, it's a first generation V4 series introduced in 1982. I think it's an early VFR.
Yeah, or even VF.
Yeah, right. A VF. I was going to say VF 750F or something.
The very first Honda V4 was 82 was a kind of a cruiser bike, wasn't it? And I can't remember what did they call it, VF something, and then the VF 750 sports bike came out in 73, 74. No, sorry, 83, 84. So yeah, it's obviously one of those early VF 750s, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm ready to hear what it is. I feel like if it's not a Honda, we're all going to look pretty silly.
Well, we are all correct in the fact that it is a Honda.
Okay.
Matt, Zach, Spurge, thanks for playing along today. This bike was sent in by Joseph. It is a 1985 Honda VF 500F.
500.
VF 500F. So that's why it sound a little bit timid because it's a small engine. I guess that makes sense.
Some fun.
Hang on. The VF 500F was a twin, not a 4. What are they on?
Nope. So some fun facts depending on where you lived in the world, Matt.
Yeah.
So this is known as the Interceptor in US and Canada.
Right.
Honda's VF and later VFR series was introduced in 1982. Prior to this, the V4 design was very rare in production motorcycles. And Mat Oxley placed first place in the Isle of Man TT in the 100 to 250cc class on a 1985 Honda. So producer Chase always tries to tie this in to our guests. So the reason he went with a 1985 Honda VF 500F is because that was the same year of the Honda that you won the Isle of Man TT on.
I can say I can get out of this one. I can say, well, we never had the VF 504 in the UK. So
there you go. Okay,
I would have got it otherwise.
What was the Matt? What was the engine configuration of the Honda that you won the Isle of Man on?
Two-stroke V-twin.
Two-stroke V-twin.
Yeah, two-stroke V-twin.
That's going to sound very different than this 1985 VF 500F.
Ning,
that's more of the ning, I believe.
Ning.
Right. Okay. Well, stumped as we all were, I had a blast talking to you about the history of MotoGP and motorcycle racing, Matt. We understand by the level of light in your room there that it's pretty much bedtime for you. We appreciate you hanging out.
No, it's just dinner time. That's all. Yeah.
Okay, good.
No, you're not kept me up.
As someone that has read your work, it was absolutely a pleasure for getting to talk to you today. And I want to thank you for taking the time. For those people out there that are listening that might not be familiar outside of the MotoGP podcast, what books would you recommend for the holiday list this year if people want to get a little bit more of your work?
Well, Stealing Speed, which is on my website, which is, if you Google Mat Oxley Big Cartel, that'll take you to my website. And, you can get Stealing Speed on there. You can pre-order it. And I did another racing history book called Racing Hitler, which is all about the 1930 speed race between BMW, Gilera and Brough Superior in Britain. It's kind of similar story in the way. It's one of those collisions of motorbikes, daring do on motorbikes, politics, technology, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, and yeah, if you're into MotoGP, listen to me and Peter Bomb. We have a thing called the Oxley Bomb MotoGP podcast. We do one every Sunday, and reporting on the races or whatever. And Peter's an engineer. I'm a former racer, so he's won 3 world championships as an engineer: Supersport World Championship, Moto3 World Championship, and Moto2 World Championship. So he really knows his stuff. So it's a technical sport. Things always happen in motorbike racing for technical reasons, big or small. So we really look into. We don't tell you what happened, because if you watch it, you already know. We try and tell you why it happened, which is to me, that's why I like being a MotoGP journalist, because I get to find out, okay, so why is this guy suddenly going fast? Well, it's because he's doing this, or because he's got that on his bike. That's what I love, chasing those little stories, I love doing that stuff.
Well, we will, for our audience listening, we were going to put some links in the description down below. We'll put a link to Matt's podcast, and we'll also put a link to Matt's website. So if you do want to add any of Matt's books to your holiday reading list, especially, it gets cold in the wintertime. It's not necessarily, depending on where you're listening, you might not be able to ride your motorcycles in the winter, and you want to curl up next to the fire with a good book, and Matt's books will surely inspire you to get out and race once the springtime comes around.
I can't even afford electricity for lighting, as you can see.
I know. I'm surprised your computer hasn't shut off.
Quite funny for people kind of watching it gradually go dark and thinking, what the hell's going on? And I kind of look like I got something out of a horror movie or something. So I'm apologies to anyone who's been scared by me. But thanks you to Spurge, Zach, and Chase. You've been great. I've really enjoyed it. I always love talking about motorbikes, and it's been super nice chatting to you. And I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it. Yeah.
It was absolutely a pleasure, Matt. Hopefully we'll get to see you again soon. And for now, you go enjoy that dinner. You definitely earned it.
All right, guys. Take it easy.
Cheers. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that conversation as much as we did. Truly an honor to get to talk to Matt. He's somebody that, I've read for years. My first time getting to talk to him was in pre-production for this podcast, and he's definitely a character with lots of stories.
For sure. He's in some ways the epitome of encyclopedic memory, sort of. He just has such a wealth of knowledge between his ears about the history of racing and the culture of it all, and obviously, coming on 40 years of experience of being in the paddock. It's really, really cool to talk to him. We are already brainstorming, for what it's worth, of other topics we'd like him to cover. If you have one, feel free to send it over to Highside, Lowside at RevZilla.com.
If there's something that you'd like to hear Matt talk to us about, we already are talking about like how to bring him back on.
Exactly.
In the meantime, you can again, Matt's website is Matt, M-A-T, only one T in Matt, Oxley, O-X-L-E-Y. So mattoxley.bigcartel.com. We'll get you over to be able to purchase some of the books that he has. And then if you want to check out his podcast, it's the Oxley Bomb podcast, or the Oxley Bomb MotoGP podcast, rather. Mm-hmm. And you can get that wherever you get your favorite podcast. It's Matt and Peter Bomb talking about MotoGP.
Next up, we're going to give away a t-shirt. We have two gosh darn many of them, as usual. The winner this week is R9T Bertoli, who says, and I quote, "Dudes, you did it. The show went from 5 stars to 6 when you added the video to podcasts on Spotify. Now I can just glance at my phone and see what you're talking about instead of the pain of Google searching all the time. Love the podcast. Been listening since day one. Sorry, this is my first time rating it. I'm that lazy." Hey, we're not gonna condemn.
We're
not
you shy
lazy.
About being lazy. That's exactly. Zach and I are pretty familiar with the concept.
That's right. Most of the motivation around here comes from Chase, as we all know. So this is great to hear, because we have embraced the upload of video to Spotify podcasts. We weren't sure if it was doing a darn thing, but it sounds like R9T Bertoli has confirmed that it works, and they like it. So that buoyed our spirits, and for that you get a t-shirt, Bertoli.
And depending on when you're listening to this, we are working on a new design for Highside Lowside for the t-shirts. We have the existing Highside Lowside t-shirt will continue to exist, but we're working on a special Highside Lowside engine sound. No, I'm sorry, I did this again. It's a Highside Lowside drinking game t-shirt. If you remember back to an earlier season, we had a listener write in and actually wrote out the rules to Highside Lowside drinking game. We've referenced it many a time in the podcast. So we figured it would be fun to make a t-shirt commemorating the game. And that t-shirt should be out later this year, maybe before the end of the year, maybe in time for the holidays. So you can get a Mat Oxley book that you can read while you're wearing your brand new Highside, Lowside drinking game t-shirt.
Drinking your Arnold Palmer or your soda water with lime or, whatever.
If you have to ride home. But if you're already at home and you have this with a fire going in the fireplace while you're listening to Zach and I and the soothing sounds of Mat Oxley's British accent, then by God, you deserve a stiff cocktail for getting through the last 2 hours.
So, R9T Bertoli, please do send your preferred t-shirt size and your mailing address to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com, and we will send you some swag. Spur Jonas, moving on.
Nicholas wrote in and said, this is the Highside Lowside comment. For those of you that have something that you want to dive in a little bit deeper, you can always shoot us an email to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com with your thoughts, your comments, your concerns. Nicholas says, a few episodes back, you discussed why you don't like modern motorcycles and agreed on fueling. However, I genuinely feel that fueling on modern bikes is great. For instance, when I tested the KTM 890 Adventure R a couple of years back, I was perfectly pleased with the fueling. Nicholas is making a reference to the fact that I talked about the 890 fueling on my bike not being that great. And he says, he goes on to say, there's obviously differences in views on the topic. He's looked at other people out there, reviewing other motorcycles where they talk about how great the Honda is in Europe versus North America, and the differences there. So really, Nicholas's question is, do we have different opinions on the matter due to EPA restrictions, or is it just a matter of my experience is different than your experience on fueling? Zach, what do you think is happening here? Why is Nicholas's opinion maybe different than ours?
Because Nicholas is not as refined, experienced, or as handsome as we are. So it's just, I'm afraid you're just
Did you not see the attached picture?
Oh, sorry. There it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a good looking person there. Oh, okay. Excuse me.
Yeah.
No, what I actually meant to say was, yes, you're right, Nicholas. Motorcycles are different depending on where you are in the world. That is true. The restrictions, regulations, and rules that motorcycles that are manufactured or that are sold in the United States have to follow to be sold in the United States are different than the ones in Europe, than the ones in Australia, than the ones in India, than the ones in
South America, Canada,
Africa, anywhere. So it does make a difference. And of course, the most pertinent conversation is usually the difference between European regs and North American or American regs, because those are two of the biggest markets in the world. But yeah, it can be different. This is why one of the reasons that we struggle with press launches. Sometimes you go to a press launch, you ride a bike, you ride a new, whatever, Aprilia, Ducati, Yamaha, something around Spain for a day or two. And you think like, okay, and you write up your report. And then, 3 months later, 9 months later, you ride the bike in the United States and you're like, hey, the blinkers are different, that the engine doesn't feel the same. There are different rules and regulations, and bikes can feel different. So that's a fair commentation.
This is actually part of the reason, Zach and I, last year at this time, maybe a little bit earlier than this time, we're riding the new Triumph 400s in India. And we talked about like, oh, well, it's not really fair for us to do a first ride review of these motorcycles, because by the time we get to the United States, they're not going to be what the Indian market has specifically. And, Zach recently rode a Speed 400 in the United States. Fun fact, we're actually giving away your chance to win a Triumph Speed 400 or Scrambler 400. So we'll throw a link in the sweepstakes for that down below. But my point is that it is a little bit different. And the other thing to note here too is how you ride the bike is going to be different. So specifically to the call out on the 890, the issue that I have with that bike is if you're trying to just sit at 39 to 4,100 RPM and just kind of keep it cruising speed on the highway, at times it doesn't want to sit there. It feels like it's stumbling on itself for searching. But if you're on the gas a little bit and maybe you're letting it sit at 6,000 or 7,000 RPM, it feels completely fine. And if you're romping through that little rough section in the RPM range and you're never letting the bike just kind of sit there and cruise, you might never notice that the fueling is a problem. And I think, that's the other thing that comes into play too. Everybody rides a bike a little bit differently. And where you let the bike idle. Zach and I, we were talking about that trip in India. Zach would be in 6th gear at, 55 miles an hour trying to go fuel efficiency. And I'd be at 75 in 3rd gear with it wound out. And he's like, what is wrong with you? He's like, just upshift.
Exactly right.
It's just upshift. So yeah, but I think that's a perfect example of like, depending on where you are in the RPM range, it's going to feel different too.
Yes, indeed. Well, I hope that sheds a little light on how we feel about it, Nicholas. That's a good point. Interesting thing to call out, and worth remembering for anyone who is reading a review, watching a video, listening to anyone else's opinion about a bike. It depends on where in the world they are, and of course how they pilot the machine. Okay, Spurge, holy cow. We survived this. This has been a marathon. We appreciate all of you stuck around this far. We would remind you that if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment below with suggestions or anything you'd like us to know. You can send your comments and your engine sounds. That is a 30-second clip of your bike starting up, revving, and then shutting off to Highside, Lowside at RevZilla.com. And of course, we hope that you share this podcast with your friends.
So my question for you, Zach, as we round this out is, I am definitely I have an appreciation for MotoGP, and I think for me, from a historical standpoint, I like the stories. I really love what happened here today because, Matt kind of gave some of these fun stories into the history and the background, which really plays into my personal love of history. But you are a true MotoGP enthusiast.
Yes.
You know the names, you know the history, you have a deep knowledge. What was your favorite part about today? Getting to talk to somebody like Matt, like, this was an episode you've wanted to do for a while around MotoGP. Tell me what your thoughts are. That's what I want to know.
This is easy, and it's got nothing to do with motorcycles. It's got everything to do with juggernauts. Why do we not call them juggernauts? Juggernaut is an amazing name for a tractor trailer. I can't believe we don't call them juggernauts. I'm going to submit to the Secretary of Language at the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C.
You're going to call Webster over at Webster's Dictionary?
Exactly. Oxford, Webster, call them all up. Get them all in the same room. We're changing it to Juggernaut. That is such a good name for a tractor trailer.
After all the seasons of doing this podcast with you, where you've wanted to talk about MotoGP
I know.
and motorcycle racing, and we finally sat down, we got Mat Oxley, like the premier MotoGP journalist, to sit down with us. We figured all this out. We did an episode on MotoGP, and your biggest takeaway is why don't we call them juggernauts?
I am who I am.
I didn't see that coming. I didn't see it coming.
I am who I am. I don't know what to tell you. That was the revelation this time around. No, it was dynamite to have Matt on the program, and I love the way his mind works and the way he explains things, and he's a true historian of the sport, and I just appreciate having him around so much. What about you? Any last thoughts, takeaways?
I would just look forward to having him back on. Genuinely. Yes. I mean, I think for the audience listening, we tried to keep this one a little bit top of funnel. We tried to keep this a little bit more general so that everybody could kind of appreciate it, whether you have any knowledge about MotoGP or a lot of knowledge about MotoGP or no knowledge about MotoGP. And I think for me, I would love to pick Matt's brain a little bit deeper in certain areas. And maybe that is something that we could do in the future, because he truly is a gem in the world of motorcycle history.
Indeed. Okay. All right. Well, I don't know what else to say. Start calling semi-trucks juggernauts, please.
Add Stealing Speed to your holiday list. Stealing Speed is truly an excellent book. You can get the graphic novel version, which we had here at the office, so I could pull it up as an example. So if you like looking at pretty pictures more than you like reading, there is a graphic novel version. But for me personally, the actual novel is a must-have on your library shelf. And it sounds like you no longer have to spend $140 to buy a used copy on Amazon. Matt is going to be reprinting it so you can get the book from his website, and give it to a motorcyclist on your list this holiday season.
Yes, indeed. With that, everybody, thanks for hanging out for another episode of Highside, Lowside. We will see you on the other side.
Cheers.